Much of the news today about the crash of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was broken by President Obama. He told us at least one U.S. citizen was among the 298 who died. He said the plane was shot down by a surface-to-air missile fired from a part of Ukraine controlled by pro-Russian rebels. Those rebels are fighting to break away from Ukraine. And while the president stopped short of saying that the Kremlin was behind the downing of Flight 17, listen to what he said about the rebels who have boasted about shooting down at least 3 Ukrainian military planes.
A group of separatists can't shoot down military transport planes, or they claim shoot down fighter jets without sophisticated equipment and sophisticated training, and that is coming from Russia.
We have a team of correspondents on this story. First, we'll go to Mark Phillips at the crash site in eastern Ukraine, where the reality of what has happened can be difficult to watch.
The arguments may be raging over who did this, but there is almost nothing being done to investigate this site or to care for the remains of the victims of the Malaysian air disaster. In a field in eastern Ukraine, the wreckage and the bodies lie entangled, exposed, neglected. Volunteers have been looking for victims, overseen by the pro-Russian rebel militias which control the area. Without proper resources to effect a disaster of this scale, the local people have been out spotting the bodies. You can see the little sticks with ribbons at the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 bodies lying in a field just here. And the crash scene is spread over 9 miles of countryside. There are unbearable images wherever you look. And the crash area is still not secure. People have been moving through this crime scene. A full day after a major air disaster like this, and a crash site would normally be crawling with investigators and people retrieving the bodies of the victims. The fields here are full of bodies. But this is a crash site in a war zone. Getting at the truth won't be easy. The first attempt at an investigation did not go well. Monitors from the OSCE, the European security body, had been assured of protection and unfettered access, but the rebels only allowed them a brief visit. And the plane's black box data recorders have not been produced, despite earlier rebel claims that they had found them. OSCE spokesman Michael Bosyurkiv.
The location of the black box is a huge concern because it's a major piece of evidence. They were also concerned about the perimeter, whether it's been secured to avoid tampering or looting.
Time is critical in crash investigations, and the time here is ticking away. And it is the pro-Moscow rebels here who are most under suspicious for bringing down the plane, and it is they, Scott, who control the evidence.
Flight 17 was en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. In both cities, relatives are grieving for the loved ones they lost. Nearly 2/3 of the victims were Dutch, dozens more Malaysian. The victims came from at least 11 countries, and at least one was born in the United States. Here's Jim Axelrod.
Born to 2 Dutch nationals, 19-year-old Quinn Schansman held dual American-Dutch citizenship. It was left to his girlfriend of 10 months to post heartbreaking Facebook pictures of a beautiful young couple just getting started. Facebook also provided a haunting image of Tambi G, his wife Ariza Ghazali, and their 4 children. They were moving back home to Malaysia, the last picture posted by the mom, their suitcases, curbside. Nick Norris from Australia was taking his 3 grandchildren home, Mo, 12, Evie, 10, and Otis, 8. They'd all been on vacation, but the granddad took the kids home early so the parents could have a few days on their own. Carlene Kaiser was Dutch, but went to school at the University of Indiana, where she was a top-notch rower studying for her doctorate in chemistry. Sanjeed Singh Sandhu was a 41-year-old flight attendant everyone called Bobby. He wasn't scheduled to work the flight, but switched shifts with a colleague.
Sandhu switched onto that flight and died. Scott, his wife, is also a Malaysia Airlines flight attendant. She was scheduled to work on the Malaysia jet that disappeared 4 months ago, but she switched off that flight at the last minute and lived.
Jim, thanks very much. Mike Morrell has been giving us insight into the downing of the plane. Mr. Morell, the president says that the Russians had some involvement. How much involvement, in your opinion?
There's different degrees of complicity here, Scott. The first level we are already at, which is Putin encouraged these separatists. He has funded them, he has equipped them, he has trained them. If you feed the beast, you're responsible for what the beast has done. We're already there. There's additional possible complicity, which is, did Putin and the Russians give the separatists this particular weapon system, and did they train them? And then did any Russian special forces actually assist in the firing of the missile?
How would the United States ever prove these things?
You're not going to know from investigating the crash site. We're not going to find it that way. The only way we're going to find out is through intelligence. We could learn quickly. It may take some time. We may never know.
Where does this leave Vladimir Putin?
I think regardless of the level of complicity, he's in a very bad place. If you think back to the Soviet Union's downing of the South Korean aircraft in 1983, that was a turning point in the Cold War. It showed the world what the Soviet Union was all about. That same thing could happen to Putin now.
Mike Morell, former deputy director of the CIA. Thanks again.
You're welcome, Scott.
President Obama called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today to talk about the risk of further escalation of the conflict with Palestinians in Gaza, and it is escalating. This is the second day of the ground invasion that Netanyahu ordered. Holly Williams is in Gaza City.
Tonight, even with troops on the ground, the Israeli military continues to bombard the Gaza Strip. So far, Israel says this is a limited offensive aimed at destroying Palestinian rocket launchers, as well as tunnels dug by the militants to infiltrate Israeli territory. In most of the Gaza Strip, they haven't yet seen a single Israeli soldier. In Beit Lahia, just over a mile from the border with Israel, we found the streets eerily quiet. The Israeli military told residents to evacuate the town before the invasion, and many people heeded the warning. In Gaza City, we arrived on the scene just after a direct hit decimated this building. But as they picked their way through the rubble, suddenly people began to run for cover.
What just happened back there is that people heard a drone overhead, and so they panicked and ran, thinking another airstrike was coming in. This whole place is really on edge today.
But Friday is the Muslim holy day, and in a mood of defiance, many people came out to pray. This conflict has raged for decades, and 92-year-old Mohammed Omar Susi told us if he were a young man, he'd fight the Israelis himself.
We were weak in the first time, but now we are stronger than the Jews, yeah.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said today that he's ordered the country's military to prepare for a possible expansion of the ground offensive. And tonight, Scott, the Gaza Strip is being pummeled with airstrikes and heavy caliber weapons.
Holly Williams, remarkable coverage all week. Thank you. President Obama said today that Russian President Vladimir Putin has the power to end the violence in Ukraine. Major Garrett is at the White House for us tonight. Major?
Scott, the White House wants to make Russian President Vladimir Putin, in the words of one top advisor, squirm for the strategic mistake of arming the separatists and use global outrage over this tragedy to de-escalate the conflict. At the United Nations, the administration presented its evidence Russian-backed rebels brought the plane down. President Obama called it an outrage of unspeakable proportions.
The violence that's taking place there is facilitated in large part, because of Russian support. And they have the ability to move those separatists in a different direction.
The White House will not provide more military aid to the Ukrainian government, arguing the region needs fewer weapons, not more. And for the moment, no new U.S. economic sanctions against Russia are contemplated either, though President Obama just wrapped up a conversation with German Chancellor Angela Merkel and British Prime Minister David Cameron to assess Europe's willingness to increase economic pressure on Russia on its own.
The White House will now go to the Kremlin, where the Russians are saying, don't blame us. Clarissa Ward is in Moscow.
As U.S. officials pointed the finger at pro-Russian separatists and their sponsors in Moscow, President Vladimir Putin laid the blame elsewhere. This tragedy would not have happened, he said, if the fighting had not been restarted in the southeast of Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry went further, blaming the Ukrainian military. It claimed that a Ukrainian Buk anti-aircraft missile battery, like this one, had been operational in the border region, though the Russians stopped short of saying there was any evidence that it fired the fatal missile. Russian citizens today laid flowers outside the Dutch and Malaysian embassies. But the tragedy has put the Russian government in an awkward situation. One of the military commanders of the separatist rebels in Ukraine is Igor Girkin, a Russian citizen. Earlier this week, Girkin took credit for allegedly shooting down a military aircraft. And a recording released by the Ukrainian government caught another commander telling his Russian handler that his men had shot down a plane, making it more difficult for Moscow to avoid responsibility for the rebels' actions.
And Clarissa's joining us now by the Moscow River and the Kremlin. Clarissa, you recognize the voice of that commander on the tape.
I do, absolutely, Scott, because that commander, Bies, actually detained our crew in Ukraine a couple of months ago. We were stopped at a checkpoint. We were blindfolded. We were held for hours. One crew member was beaten. No reason was given for the detention. And we were only released, apparently, Scott, after a Russian commander intervened and gave the order.
Clarissa, thanks very much. Also among the victims were nearly 100 experts on AIDS who were heading to a medical conference in Melbourne, Australia. Former President Bill Clinton will be addressing that same conference next week. Mr. Clinton said he was sickened by what happened, and he called them martyrs to the cause in the battle against AIDS. More now from Elizabeth Palmer.
Among the men and women of science who died in this crash was a giant. Joop Lange, doctor, visionary, and campaigner who spearheaded the push to get cheap antiretroviral drugs to the poor.
Joop was treating the first AIDS patients in.
His friend and fellow researcher Tobias Rinke de Wit.
I think the greatest achievement of Joop is to really give a face to the nameless people, mostly in Africa and in Asia, who were suffering from one of the biggest epidemics of all times.
His partner in life and work was Jacqueline van Tongeren, traveling with him to the conference in Australia.
Our organization is...
Sun Ding, a colleague, is still struggling to accept that Jacqueline is gone.
What will you miss most? Her laughter and her saying to me, soon we'll make it.
It must seem very unreal, even now.
Totally unreal. Totally. I miss her greatly.
All of the nearly 100 AIDS and HIV scientists and activists who lost their lives will be terribly missed. But the fierce dedication of champions like Joop Lange lives on.
It's going to leave a big hole.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're not going to stop. I mean, we will keep filling in his legacy. This is not the end, certainly not.
Of course, the work on HIV will go on. But this tragedy represents quite a setback. As one Australian researcher put it, Scott, what if the cure for AIDS was on that plane?
Liz Palmer for us in Amsterdam tonight. Thank you. Tonight, hot, dry winds are fanning wildfires in 6 western states. Hundreds of families have been forced from their homes, and some have no home to go back to. Carter Evans reports Washington is among the hardest hit.
Smoke rose 25,000 feet over the largest fires burning in Washington state. The fire that's destroyed 100 homes in Potreros has scorched more than 168,000 acres. Josh Allen was turned away at a roadblock.
Probably the hardest thing I've had to do. Knowing that your house is burning up.
This fire on the eastern slopes of the Cascade Mountains produced a wall of flames that moved in on the town of Leavenworth. 900 homes have been evacuated, including Tim Germain's.
It really looked like, the cauldron of hell. You could see flames everywhere you looked. With this kind of heat and wind, it looks like eastern Washington's going to burn to the ground.
Across the country, 12 states are experiencing severe to extreme drought conditions. At U.S. Forest Service headquarters in Los Angeles, they're juggling assets to cover areas at risk. But Forest Supervisor Thomas Contreras says that causes other problems.
How does that impact you down here?
Well, it impacts me because now I have a hole where we've moved our assets up there, and again, we want to provide the protection that's necessary here. We will get resources from other parts of the United States to fill in our gaps.
The last time this part of the Angeles National Forest got any rain was back in February. And Scott, it was barely measurable.
Carter, thanks very much.
Israel's offensive against the Gaza Strip is in its 11th day. At least 292 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's aerial and ground assaults on the besieged enclave. The Palestinian Health Ministry has reported 4 more deaths caused by an airstrike in southern Gaza. Earlier, 8 members of a single family, among them women and a child, were killed when an Israeli tank shell hit their home in the Beit Hanun neighborhood. In addition, two brothers aged 4 and 7 were killed when the Shujaiya neighborhood was shelled. 50 Gazans, including children, infants, women and the elderly people, have been killed since the beginning of Israel's ground incursion on Thursday night. Israeli jets and tanks pounded east and southern and northern Gaza all day on Friday. Over 2,000 Palestinians have been injured in the attacks. Palestinian medical sources say around a quarter of the dead are children. Meanwhile, barrages of rockets fired by Palestinian resistance groups continue to hit Israeli cities and towns. Israeli media outlets say rockets have hit the city of Eshkol. Warning sirens also sounded in Tel Aviv, and shortly afterwards an explosion was heard. The Palestinian resistance movement, Hamas, has stepped up its military campaign against Israel in the wake of Tel Aviv's ground incursion into the Gaza Strip, which began late on Thursday. 1 Israeli soldier was killed and at least 3 were wounded in clashes with Palestinian resistance fighters in Gaza. Meanwhile, the military wing of Hamas, the Qassam Brigades, has denied Israel's claim that Israeli troops have discovered tunnels used by resistance fighters in Gaza. The Qassam Brigades also said their attacks on Israeli cities will continue until Tel Aviv recognizes the rights of the Palestinians. And 296 is the latest death toll we're receiving from the Palestinian territories as a result of the Israeli offensive, which has entered its 12th day. Well, as the Israeli attacks continue, medical sources say dozens of Palestinians, including children, have died from suffocation due to inhaling poisonous gas. The Palestinian Health Ministry spokesman said a strange toxic gas has been launched by the Israeli army during its ground incursion into the north and south of the Gaza Strip. Dr. Ashraf al-Ghidra said the Palestinian casualties arrived at hospitals suffering from suffocation after inhaling a white gas fired by the Israeli forces. Al-Ghidra urged the Palestinians in Gaza to protect themselves against the toxic gas by preventing toxic gases from leaking inside their safe rooms. US President Barack Obama says he's assured Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Washington's support for Tel Aviv's assault on the Gaza Strip.
I reaffirmed my strong support for Israel's right to defend itself. No nation should accept rockets being fired into its borders or terrorists tunneling into its territory. In fact, while I was having the conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu, sirens went off in Tel Aviv. I also made clear that the United States and our friends and allies are deeply concerned about the risks of further escalation and the loss of more innocent life.
Obama also said that Washington wants Tel Aviv to only deal with the tunnels in its ground invasion into Gaza. He said that the US and its allies are working to facilitate a return to the 2011 ceasefire between the Palestinians and the Israelis. He said Secretary of State John Kerry is prepared to travel to the region for that matter. Further in his speech, Obama urged the Israeli leaders to minimize the civilian casualties in their assault on Gaza.
Upon state police arrival, there was one individual who we believe was partially ejected or ejected from the bus, and the bus came to rest on that individual. Numerous individuals, passerbys, witnesses assisted the state police with getting the bus off of that individual, and life-saving measures were attempted. However, that individual succumbed to their injuries. What I can comment on the driver of the bus is he has been the subject of inspections in 2 states in the past year that have been documented, and in all 3 of those inspections, he passed those inspections. So there's no reason to believe that he had any problems with his driving credentials or anything of that nature. That bus contains what is commonly referred to as a black box, if you will. It has data recorded on it as to braking, as to speed, and we are going to be able to download that at some point in the future and analyze that to see if any of those types of activities may have contributed to the cause of the crash.
The super typhoon Ramasan has made landfall in the coastal areas of southern China's island province of Hainan. That happened Friday afternoon. According to the Provincial Meteorological Bureau, the super typhoon landed in Wenchen City at around 3 p.m. Friday. The maximum wind speed at the center of Ramasan reached 216 kilometers per hour. It is reportedly the strongest typhoon to hit southern China since 1973. More than 70,000 residents near the landfall region have been evacuated. The local Red Cross Society is delivering tents and rice to the area, and the Red Cross Society of China is also allocating disaster relief goods to the province. All tourism resorts have closed and tour bus companies have suspended operations. Meanwhile, the neighboring Guangdong province authorities have launched the highest level of emergency response. Construction projects, schools, and businesses have been suspended. The typhoon has brought torrential rains to Hainan, Guangzhou, and Guangxi. Meanwhile, meteorological authorities say the typhoon might land again tonight or tomorrow morning in Guangxi.
Iran's President Hassan Rouhani has described Israel's aggression against the Gaza Strip as an inhumane and criminal act, calling for an immediate end to the offensive. In a telephone conversation with his Russian counterpart, Hassan Rouhani said the blockade of Gaza and the killing of Palestinian women and children have caused a terrible tragedy. He urged the international community to act urgently and put an end to the bloodshed of innocent civilians. According to the Iranian president, the international community should condemn Tel Aviv's aggression and help lift the siege on Gaza. The Russian president, for his part, expressed concern about the events in Gaza, saying that the situation has become intolerable. Vladimir Putin added that all influential countries must do their utmost for an immediate ceasefire.
There are 41 wars being fought around the world right now. Most of us are busy and we race through our weeks without paying a great deal of attention. But yesterday, this week, stopped because one of those wars reached into the sky and grabbed 298 people who could have been any of us. The lives they lived lie across fields of wheat and sunflowers. So familiar, a book for tweens, a doll that was probably the most important thing in the world for someone. There were many children on board. It is a view of humanity that is only seen when it's too late. This was the limit of the vision of the missile crew, the radar, fire control, and a simple touch of a button. They never laid eyes on the enemy they imagined. The same has been true this week in Israel and Gaza. Islamic militants have launched unguided rockets blindly into Israel. One Israeli civilian was killed. And it was true for the Israeli sailors who never saw the 4 boys on the beach before their long-range rockets exploded. Triggers pull easily when there's nothing clear in the sights. What does come into focus is our shared humanity, and what struck us this week was how similar these pictures are. Which is Ukraine? Which Gaza? Which one is Israel? Which is Amsterdam? Which is Malaysia? The wars will continue next week, but for a day we stopped and remembered how much greater man's reach can be than his vision.